Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the new early intervention forms that will go into effect July 1st of 2019. This is Lori Myers, and I'm the Early Intervention Training Coordinator. And we have with me today our content expert, Katrina Bush, who is an Early Intervention Project Manager. And we also have Diane Fox, who is the EI Program Manager. So what we want to do today is just give a few highlights on each of the new forms and answer the questions that were submitted in advance. We're not going to be walking through each form step by step because that information can be found in the forms course that we have available on My Learning. So this will be more of a brief review and then focusing on the questions. You can feel free to keep submitting questions during the webinar today. However, we're not going to be answering new questions today. Instead, we're going to research the answers and respond in an FAQ that will be posted to our website. And that will be found under the Early Intervention Rules 2019 tile, which we'll show you in just a couple minutes. If you do have clarifying questions about any of the answers that we're giving today, we will do our best to answer them today. All right, so before we get into the content and the questions, we just wanted to remind you of the resources that you can find on our website. And I'm going to pull up the website real quick so I can show them to you. If you'll bear with me for just a moment. I have it saved as a favorite, but in case you don't, the URL is just ohioearlyintervention.org. So it's pulling it up for me now. All right, so this is the home page that you'll see when you get to the website. And then to get to the rule resources, you'll want to click on this yellow Providers tab. And then if you scroll to the bottom, the tile is called Early Intervention Rules 2019. And then that page will give you a number of different resources related to the rules. So as soon as the rules go into effect July 1st, we'll have them posted here. Right now they're listed as proposed rules since it's not quite that date yet. Then we have a list of the rule courses that are available, and those are on My Learning. So there's a link to My Learning, and then there are instructions if you need to set up an account or if you have not yet accessed courses and you need to know how to do that. Below that, we have the recordings of these webinars. This one is being recorded as well, and the recording will be posted to the website. So if someone on your team is not able to listen in today, they can always watch the recordings later on. And then we have the schedule of our remaining webinars. There's just a couple more left in the series. Below that, we have the schedule for the regional in-person trainings that we'll be doing in August, September, and October. The registration is not available for those yet, but you can look at the dates and kind of save those dates. And then finally, we have a section called Guidance Documents and FAQs. So this is where we're posting the FAQs from all of these webinars and some other helpful resources. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. All right, so just a reminder of why we're doing these rule webinars. Basically, we want you to be prepared for when the rules do take effect on July 1st. So we wanted to be able to give you the opportunity to read through the rules, read through the forms, and formulate your questions, and then get those questions answered before you're actually implementing the new rules and using the new forms. So we hope by doing these webinars will help you to really feel prepared and to be able to implement those when they go into effect. We'll still have follow-ups, TA, all of those things available, but this will at least give you a good start as we all start using these new rules and these new forms. All right, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Diane, and she will give you some more information.
Thank you, Lori. And welcome, all 400 plus of you. Thank you so much. Your attendance has been phenomenal. On average, about 575 or more of us are participating consistently on these calls, and we hope that you find them helpful. I want to stress a couple important things, particularly as we finish this section of the forms and move to the IFSP, Form 04, and then also Form EI-09. It is very important that you participate in the rule recording, take a look at the rule, and then send in your questions to us. And then we will review and answer your questions on the webinar. The FAQs are taking us a little longer than expected because we're getting more questions after the webinar than we are prior to the webinar. So please send in your questions prior to the webinar. That will help speed things up greatly. But we are hoping to catch up soon and post more as soon as possible. Another heads up, and we will be sending some additional information in the biweekly on Friday, is to get the most out of the forms, or the ability to use the forms and have them work for you, so to speak. We recommend that you have the most recent Adobe version. So if you don't already, if you could begin working on that, it will make things a lot easier. We will have some information about Adobe in the recent version and how to obtain the free version in our biweekly on Friday. So please take a look at that. Also, just a reminder, when you see the FAQs, you may not see the exact question that you sent in. Rather, we will take some editorial liberty, so to speak, and frame it in a way that perhaps answers several questions. So, but if for some reason we missed your question or we didn't quite answer it, feel free to send your question in. And also a reminder, feel free to reach out to your early intervention program consultant for any additional support that you may need. All right, so today will be a little different. Typically, we kind of go over some highlights and some changes and that kind of thing. Well, all of our forms have changed, right? So we have all new forms. So we had a very large stakeholder group who helped us with making these changes. And over and over and over, the theme was clarity, clarity, clarity. So that is what we believe we have provided. And so today we're going to go over your questions. So I am going to turn it over to our content expert, Katrina Bush.
Thank you, Diane. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. So thank you again to all of you out there in webinar land. And we'll just get right on to covering our materials. With our agenda today, we will be discussing the required forms 1 through 18 with some exceptions. So we're not covering forms EI-04, the IFSP, and EI-09, prior written notice of determination of ineligibility, because we will offer a separate training, and that training is scheduled for June 18th. We are also not covering all the forms related to system of payments. There will be 2 trainings in June, part 1 on June 11th and part 2 on June 13th. So look for those trainings coming up. Today we will review the form purpose and a few key points. We will not be providing step-by-step instructions for form completion, but you can find that information in the forms course on the DoDD's My Learning. As we look at each form, we will answer associated questions that we received. So let's start with the forms that combine prior written notice and consent. Form EI-01 is only required when a developmental screening is proposed. Developmental screenings are only conducted when there is no suspected delay or disability and the parent has not requested an evaluation. This form includes an optional waiver of prior written notice. Please see the forms training for a detailed description of the use of the waiver of timeline box. We received one question related to EI-01.
Okay, Katrina, so the question is, should a prior written notice / consent be sent ahead of time? For example, if I speak to a parent on July 1st, 2019, and schedule a welcome visit or a first visit on July 5th, 2019, should I send a prior written notice consent for screening on July 1st, 2019, or should I wait for the visit?
So, as we noted in the forms training, this form may be sent ahead, and that could be mailed or emailed, or given directly to the parent. It's up to the service coordinator to make that decision about whether to send it or give it in person, and that choice is documented in the service coordinator use box in the top right of this form. Permission may not be obtained for screening or any other activity without first providing prior written notice. So you have to give the prior written notice prior to obtaining consent. And the prior written notice must include the explanation of the purpose of the activity, which you see in the top of that form. The waiver of the 10-day requirement of the prior written notice should only be offered when a provider is available to complete the activity prior to the 10 days elapsing.
Katrina, we have a clarifying question that I think you'll be able to answer. Would this be, what you just described, also be relevant for PCSA referrals?
So, sorry about that. I had a little technical difficulty.
You've got a little, yeah, so the PCSA referrals are the referrals that come in from the public children's service agencies. They automatically go to the service coordinating agency.
Okay, so yes, this applies still. The consent from the parent, the definition of parent is provided in several of the rules, and the requirement for consent to screen and the requirement for prior written notice are all required, no matter how the referral comes in.
Thank you.
There is one additional part of the question about whether the waiver of timeline is always relevant. So if the forms were mailed on 7/1/19, the activity, in this case the screening, could not occur until 10 days have elapsed. The screening could not be administered on 7/5 when the service coordinator did the home visit, unless the parent wants the screening to occur before the 10 days have elapsed. In that case, the parent would need to complete the waiver of timeline, or the screening would need to wait until after July 11th. So it's availability of the provider and the 10 days required in prior written notice or the waiver.
Okay. We're just going to pause for just like 20, 30 seconds just to give you time to think about what was just shared and if you have any questions. We did, someone did ask if we would repeat. There was a lot of noise in the background. So I just don't know if there was a particular part that you need us to repeat or. Katrina, I think we'll go, okay, wait. Okay, seems to be a little confusion about the 10-day notice and the waiver. So, so there's a couple situations, right, Katrina? There's a situation or a circumstance where the family would like to think about things or confer with family members, and they do not wish to waive their right to the timeline. And then another situation would be the family and the providers available to do the screening, and they would like for the screening to be conducted earlier. So then they have the waiver option. Is there anything you can add to that description?
I think for a lot of people, the prior written notice is confusing because of the waiver. So let me just step back. Currently in rule, what you're operating now, you have to give 10-day prior written notice. And there is no waiver of that 10-day. But we believe that the prior written notice hasn't always been given for screenings. So this effective July 1st, it is required for screenings in the federal regs as well as the state regs. So this kind of cleans that up. We know that families want to have screenings and often evaluations and assessments completed quickly, as quickly as possible. But the prior written notice of 10 days is always required. It doesn't matter if someone, a provider, someone in the EI system wants to do it more quickly. That prior written notice is a parent right under the procedural safeguards. And so the family can assume it will always take 10 days. What we have added is the waiver, the optional waiver for parents to say, no, I would like it done more quickly if you are available. If a provider is available to screen more quickly or to evaluate and assess more quickly, I would like that done sooner than the elapsing of 10 days. So it is a given that prior written notice will be provided, and that timeline is 10 days. And we've added an option for families, for parents, to waive that when a provider is available to do it more quickly. So we know this is kind of a confusing point, and we're trying to highlight it in all the training.
We have another question, Katrina. So when you use the word screening, does this refer to the vision, hearing, and nutrition screenings, or are you referring to the evaluation and assessment?
Great question. So developmental screening is now defined in Rule 02. It only, and this form references that developmental screening. It only means one thing. It means the tool that Ohio has allowed to be used as a developmental screening to determine whether there are any red flags to take a child further to an evaluation or assessment, whether the child is suspected of having a delay or disability globally. It is not, you will notice also in Rule 02, vision, hearing, and nutrition are now referenced in evaluation and assessment, both of which are also defined in Rule 02. But developmental screening has a very specific definition and purpose and only happens at one time. So the words we've used for vision status or hearing status or sometimes short screening, they are not screenings anymore. They are part of the evaluation and assessment process included in physical. And we have guidance on those, both in that rule training and in the evaluation training, which is included in the IFSP training.
Okay. So if the parent is waiving the 10 days, the service coordinator would complete this form in the home on the first visit?
So again, it depends when the form was sent or given. So if the service coordinator gives the form to the parent on the first visit, let's say July 5th, the service coordinator goes to the home, explains to the parent through the use of this form what a developmental screening is. Now again, remember, if anyone suspects a delay or disability, the screening is not done. You move right to evaluation or assessment. But if the family has asked about early intervention or it's a PCSA referral and nobody suspects a delay or disability, and you're going to screen to see if the screening reflects the possibility of a delay, then or that one should move on to evaluation and assessment, then this is what is used to explain developmental screening to the parent. And the parent right, as the service coordinator must understand, to prior written notice and what prior written notice means, after the service coordinator has explained that to the family and given them this form and referenced that forms training on what it means to give the form to the parent. Then the service coordinator can say, I am available to do the screening today if you want me to. You have the right to wait 10 days or till 10 days have elapsed, so the 11th day. But I am available to screen your child today. Would you like for me to screen your child today? If the parent says yes, then you direct them to that waiver of timeline, and the parent can complete that section if they'd like it to occur sooner. That would be as in today.
Thank you, Katrina. I think we have answered all the questions that we can.
Okay, so on our next slide, Form EIO2 is for the evaluation and child assessment, the developmental evaluation and assessment. It includes both prior written notice and consent. It also includes the optional waiver if the parent wants to waive his or her right for the 10 calendar day prior written notice prior to the proposed evaluation and assessment. And everything we've talked about through Form 01, which was screening, is applicable to this form as well. That prior written notice, that timeline, and the use of the waiver. But again, a reminder that the parent always has the right to the 10-day prior written notice. And the waiver is optional, and the waiver is new, not the prior written notice. Note also that the waiver of timeline always is relevant.
Okay. All right. So the first question is an example of several questions we received related to the correct sequence of events. So similar to the screening, a child is referred to the early intervention program on July 1st. You call the family on July 2nd to set up the first visit. This visit is scheduled for July 9th. On July 9th, you visit the family, explain early intervention, and explain the evaluation process. You provide prior written notice for the evaluation. The earliest the evaluation could be scheduled would be July 20th, unless the family waived the 10-day prior written notice. If the family waived the 10-day prior written notice, the evaluation could be conducted at any time. including on July 9th. Prior to conducting the evaluation, you would obtain consent from the family to complete the evaluation. So question, if we complete prior written notice, if we complete HEA 8018 prior to July 1st, 2019, but the evaluation and or child assessment does not happen until after July 1st, 2019, does EIO2 need to be completed?
So the answer to that is any activity required for obtaining consent or giving prior written notice prior to July 1st, when these rules go into effect, may be done using the forms and processes you have in effect prior to July 1st, 2019. So keep following the same processes, keep following the same rules. It's always more difficult during this transition time. If you need to complete a form for consent for an activity that will happen on July 4th, after July 1st, use that form to get the consent and then complete the activity following the new rule.
So Katrina, we have a question. So if a parent decides to waive their right to prior notice, for example, for the screening or for the evaluation, do we need to have these forms as carbon copies, or do we just give them a blank copy?
So let me first say you're never waiving prior written notice. You're only waiving the 10-day requirement of prior written notice. But to answer your real question, you may do either one. What we have said in the forms training is to have a blank copy there with you, or you're mailing it. Now, if you've mailed it in advance, that meets that requirement. And the only thing going to be filled out on it is today's date, which is the date you sent it, the child's name, the child's date of birth, the parent name, and the EIDS number. So those are, and then the service coordinator is keeping on her master copy or his master copy, the service coordinator use box filling in when it was mailed or given. So you are giving a blank copy because the prior written notice is the language of that introduction box at the top. That is what explains what is being proposed.
Katrina, we have a comment that, could you explain why there is a 10-day wait? It just doesn't make sense.
So that is a federal requirement under IDEA that parents are given prior written notice, and that timeline has been established for quite a number of years, at least 10, and we did not change that timeline with the new process per the input we had with stakeholders, from and with stakeholders. So it could have been 15 days, it could have been 8 days, but there has to be a timeline that gives families, not families, but parents, the ability to make decisions about what they are given consent. So prior written notice is required, and a consistent number of days needs to be determined by the state, which is how we've established that.
Okay. I think we can move on.
So in Form EIO3, prior written notice and consent for the family-directed assessment. You'll note here the requirements for the rule, where the requirements for the FDA are found in rules. You see that on your slide. This form is for the family-directed assessment only, and it includes, obviously, both prior written notice and consent. As with the previous two forms, EIO3 includes an optional waiver for the 10 calendar day prior written notice for the proposed FDA.
I think we have a couple questions. So for both EIO2 and EIO3, do we need to complete these annually?
So these forms need to be completed anytime a child evaluation or assessment, that's the O2, or a family-directed assessment is conducted. And Rule 02 defines when those are required. Not every child will need an evaluation annually, but every child and family will have an annual assessment, and so they will be completed at least annually. It is not necessary for ongoing assessment for program planning. You do not need the form for that.
Okay. Does the parent's signature on these forms expire? Is one form enough until the child turns 3?
So these prior written notice and consent forms are for very specific activities with specific timelines. While the consent does not technically expire, the consent is only valid for the activity which is described by the EI service coordinator. So assumably, for the initial evaluation for eligibility and the initial assessment for program planning to complete the first IFSP, that is what's being proposed. It's not a global, I would like to evaluate you anytime anyone on the team thinks it's needed. It is very specific, and it is the responsibility of the service coordinator to explain that purpose to the parent so the parent provides informed consent.
Do we need to get a signature every time we complete an assessment?
So as before, yes, for the annual assessment, no for any ongoing assessment for program planning that the early intervention service providers do on an ongoing basis as part of their teach process of understanding the child and family on a daily basis.
So we've got a couple comments related to the waiver and the 10 days, the prior written notice, the 10 days notice that we need to provide. How does this impact the 45-day timeline?
The same way it does now. That prior written notice is already required, and it's been required. So the requirements to get all, it is very, very possible, as we say in the forms training, that on the first visit with the service coordinator can explain the evaluation and assessment and family-directed assessment process, provide prior written notice for all of those activities, have an idea when evaluation assessments and family-directed assessment may occur, when the team might be available, and review those timelines and start scheduling and talking to family about those timelines. So I'm assuming that to some extent it happens the same way it's happening now. We believe the option for meeting the timeline gets easier with the parent option for waiving the 10-day timeline. That option does not currently exist. So currently, you must be waiting 11 days before you do the activities because there is no waiver of timeline. So we hope that that makes it streamlines the process. But again, it's a reminder that the parents always have that right to the 10 days.
We'll take one last question related to this one. So are we actually doing 2 prior written notices, one for screening and then one for evaluation?
If you're going to conduct a screening, it is a different activity from an evaluation. So yes, they are 2 separate activities, but we believe that not very many children should be screened. So that form shouldn't be required very often. Most children come into the system with a suspicion of delay or disability, and you jump right to evaluation, child evaluation and assessment. But if you plan to conduct both, yes, you must explain both and why you're doing one. And you shouldn't be doing it if someone already suspects a delay or disability. There shouldn't be an O1.
All right, we do have several other questions, but given the time, I think we better move on. We will make sure to answer all the questions in the FAQs.
So the next form is EI-10, and we're following them in the same order that we followed them in the forms training. EI-10 is another prior written notice. It's the prior written notice of exiting. It does not include parent consent. The other forms we've reviewed do require parent consent in writing. This form isn't just the notice without consent. It is used whenever a child is exited, except when the exit is because the child turns 3 or is deceased. This form must be used for any other exit reasons and corresponds to paragraph P of the Eligibility and Services Rule. When a child is transferred to another county, this is not referred to as exit in rule. However, at the local level, a county would exit the child from their program and add an exit in EIDS. In this situation, EI-10 is not needed. The EI service coordinator completes this form before providing it to the parent or parents. The parent does not have the option to waive prior written notice in this situation.
We received several questions about EI-10. The first one, Katrina, if the exit cannot occur until at least 10 days prior to the prior written notice, then it is no longer the date a child found to be ineligible or screened out or a parent declines services. Is this correct?
That is correct. And again, we know this prior written notice, it can be confusing, but the exit may not occur until 10 days after the prior written notice was provided. So you will just, and that it allows for instance, especially ineligibility, teams often are writing their reports. The day one administered the tool is not necessarily the day the report was finished and the parent was notified of the ineligibility. But yes, the parents must have that 10 days, which, as you see at the bottom of the form, there is the dispute resolution information. That all of that kind of information is covered much more extensively in the forms training. But parents have that time to file a complaint if they believe that they are being exited erroneously.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Is this 10 days from the date above or from when the prior written notice is sent? For example, I'm at a periodic IFSP review on July 1st, 2019, and the family states they no longer want services. This is unanticipated. I cannot send the prior written notice of end until 7/3/2019 due to scheduling and appointments. Is the exit date then 7/13/2019 because it's 10 days from when the prior written notice of exit was sent?
Actually, it would be 7/14 in this example, but you have really grasped the idea. You might have the form with you and complete it at that periodic review on 7/1. But if you went back to the office, completed the prior written notice of exiting on 7/3 and mailed it to the parent, that 7/3 would be the date prior written notice was given. And you would mark in the service coordinator box at the top the date and how it was sent or given to the parent. So yes.
Good. We've got a couple more. Which box is selected if the child is exiting due to moving to another county in Ohio and needs to be transferred. Clearly, there's no option to waive 10 days notice for this. So is it correct to assume that we will let the parents know the transfer will occur after 10 days?
So the transfer in and of itself is not necessarily an exit from the EI system. In some cases, families will leave the EI system and because of loss of contact or a desire to stop services while they move and then wish to re-engage with EI in a new county. In these cases where the family has left the EI system, prior written notice is required. If the family is simply changing counties and is planning a seamless transfer, prior written notice of exit is not required because the family is not leaving the EI system. They are transferring. Requirements for transfer may be found in 5123-10-02P4.
Thank you. A couple more. Does the box, your child does not meet the eligibility requirements for early intervention services, apply for redetermination of eligibility as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. There is no box for the team determining the child does not have a need for service. Is this because the mandate to determine the need for service has gone away?
That is correct. The presumption of need for service is there whenever a child is eligible.
Question, just confirming that EI-09 and EI-10 can be sent together.
Yes, they probably should be sent together.
All right, I think that's all we have time to answer for EI-10.
EI-11, prior written notice of proposed change to services. Requirements and rule related to this form may be found in the Procedural Safeguards Rule and the Eligibility and Services Rule. This form will often be completed by an EI provider other than the service coordinator who proposes to begin, end, or change an EI service from what is on the IFSP. So that is not a change from what we have now. The form has changed some, but the process for a provider proposing to begin, end, or change a service is a process we already should be used to. The second part of when this form is used is new. It's completed at each IFSP meeting when a service is initiated or changed. Generally, the EI service coordinator will summarize the IFSP team's proposed changes on this form at the IFSP meeting and provide the form to the parent or parents. This is completed before obtaining consent on the IFSP itself. As with all required prior written notices, the notice must be provided 10 calendar days before the services are changed. However, the parent has the option, as before, to waive the 10-day prior written notice. Again, the waiving of the 10 days of the prior written notice is only relevant when the parent wants it waived and when the provider is available to begin or end or change the service before the 10 days have elapsed. Those two conditions always have to be there.
Okay, Katrina, we've got several comments, so we need to go back to EI-10. Blowing up the screen, oh, well, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they want to know why it's July 14th instead of July 13th.
Maybe I did it wrong. Let me go back to my...
It's 10 calendar days.
I'm going back to look at my slide. So in the example, to be clear, if you send the notice of exit on July 3rd, a full 10 days must elapse. So the 14th is the day after the 10 calendar days have elapsed. You always count 10 days, and then you may do the activity on the next day after 10 days have elapsed.
Thank you.
No problem.
Are you ready for some questions on EI 11?
Yes.
Okay. So, will EI 11, prior written notice, need to be given as part of all IFSPs, initial, review, and annual? What if services and outcomes don't change during a review? Is this still required? What if services don't change but the outcome does? I just want to cover all possibilities.
So again, it's a reminder to remember what the definition of prior written notice is. The form is required for changes in identification, that means eligibility, placement, which hopefully won't apply very often, and services, begin, end, or change. If a review is held and nothing is initiated or changed, there's no need for the form. However, if the services were scheduled to end on the review date and new service dates are added, this is a change.
Thank you. Can any team member fill this out?
Absolutely. It is designed to be completed by EI personnel proposing a change of EI service.
Are we required to wait 10 days for the new or the change to services? Is there any way to offer services sooner, the higher or lower frequency of visits, or adding a speech language pathologist? And the provider has the availability to go out on the next visit. Is there a way we can offer the change in service sooner than 10 days? Please provide an example.
So probably in the discussion of the other forms, this question has already been answered, but a reminder that the requirement to wait 10 days is already and has been a requirement in rule. So any decrease or discontinuation of an EI service on the IFSP grid requires the prior written notice. And the exception is when a one-time support from a secondary service provider is needed to support a primary service provider. Services may only start sooner than the 10 days required in prior written notice if the provider is available, which is, I think, what this questioner is asking, and the parent wants to waive that timeline. So yes, there is a way to offer services sooner, but that requires the availability of the provider and the waiver of the timeline by the parent, who must be informed by the service coordinator that they do not have to sign that waiver.
Okay, we got a couple more. Can we see an example of how we should fill this out?
So we plan to have an example in the guidance document. So look for that. That's just forthcoming.
Could you clarify when we need to use this form?
So initial IFSP, annual IFSP, anytime you propose to change a service, that's the same as now, including when this happens at an IFSP, and that's the other time you use it, and that is new.
I'm trying to scroll as fast as I can to look for clarifying questions, but so far I don't think I have any, so go ahead and
Good job, Di. So we have some forms also that require consent but not prior written notice. I'm sure you're relieved to know that prior written notice is not always required. This Form EI-06 is the consent for release of records, that's page 1, and consent for release and or exchange of information, which will be page 2. So you'll see on page 1, it's the release of records, and should be similar to what you're familiar with. It's anticipated that this form will be initiated by a number of EI service providers, including the service coordinator. When qualified EI personnel use the form to obtain consent from the parent, that person must send the form to the EI service coordinator. The service coordinator documents in the EISC box at the top the date of receipt from the qualified provider. So that will be applicable sometimes and not other times. Please note, and it's discussed extensively in the forms training, this form is not used for EI providers or EI participating agencies, which are both defined in Rule 02. EI providers and participating agencies always have access to records and always have access to exchange of information. No consent is needed for that. The consent is valid for everyone in the EI system. It's not specifically for the person obtaining that consent. The consent is good for the system. And agencies may not put limits on what forms parents have access to once those forms are part of the EI record. So take a look at that top box describing the purpose of the consent. That information in that box, as explained to the parent, is very, very important, and it's also a great explanation for non-EI personnel, hospitals, clinics, physicians, and others who may want to limit parent access to records. As is currently the case, parents may give consent to release one or more type of EI record, and all sections of the form have to be completed. Which records, to whom, and for what purpose. And here you will see a consent is valid for, and the parent has several options to choose from. These are all federal requirements and related to parent rights. The parent must give consent using this form before any records are released to the school district. And finally, the parent signs and dates providing consent and understanding parent rights and having a copy of the parent rights brochure.
Katrina, we've got a couple requests to repeat what you shared about how this information you just shared relates to the initial IFSP.
How this information relates to the initial IFSP.
So I think initially the release of information, is that right, Julie and Lori and Jennifer? Or maybe it could be the last slide. So just clarify what you mean by initial also.
So I believe it's possible that it was not the exchange of information. The question may be about the prior written notice of proposed change to services.
That would make sense.
So at the very end there, I was saying that the question was clarify when we need this form, and we answered initial IFSP, annual IFSP, anytime you propose to change a service. So I think the word change, which we've used generically with this form, but it also, by the definition of prior written notice, it's also initiate. So the change on an initial IFSP is that you're going from no service to some service. You are initiating services. That counts. You have to give prior written notice before you begin, end, change any service. So for an initial IFSP, that's why you would complete Form EI-11, or after that, you're probably initiating some new services and changing other services. Anytime any of those activities happen, you need to complete EI-11. So back to Form EI-6. We'll go to the next slide. And you'll see page 2. And this page is for exchange of information. This generally will apply to the parent wanting to grant consent for 2 persons, usually one EI personnel and one non-EI personnel, to talk and exchange information. This consent allows any of a family's EI providers to share information with identified non-EI personnel. Because remember, EI service providers may always exchange information among themselves without obtaining consent. So as on page 1, all sections must be completed. The parent provides consent at the bottom of the page. And your case notes are going to provide any supporting documentation.
All right. So I think we do have a couple questions. One quick question. Is there a list of providers that we do not need to have consent or release of information for?
So we have defined in Rule 02, and I'm going to flip to that, which is the Eligibility and Services Rule. In B, which is the definition, we've defined Early Intervention Program, which is the statewide system. You'll be familiar with that. Early Intervention Service Provider means any entity that, or an individual who, provides early intervention services under Part C, and may include, where appropriate, the department and a public agency responsible for providing services. So that anyone providing services according to our rules and the federal law are EI providers. You'll see that definition, and I will also direct you to participating agency, which is in the same rule definition with additional information. So these are people who agree to provide services under IDEA.
Okay. So the questions that we received, I think we have a couple. Please define case notes and assessments. For example, is an ASQ considered an assessment or screening? Or did I jump ahead here?
We did, but I'll go ahead and answer that, and we'll come back. So developmental screening and assessment are also both defined in Rule 02, the Eligibility and Services Rule. ASQ is a developmental screening tool, and you will find information about case notes in the online course in My Learning, and we'll put more information into the FAQ.
Okay. If we're only using one page, just wanting to send another provider an email update, but not the IFSP or any assessments, do we cross out the boxes on the first page and write NA?
So you can just leave them blank. You're just going to obtain parent consent for the activities you are proposing, and making sure the parent can say no to that. You're not going to send an email. But remember, when EI providers communicate, this form is not necessary at all.
Okay. All right. On page 2, in the first box regarding consent for release and exchange of information, sorry, I've kind of lost. What are some examples of what would be filled in to answer the questions? Or wait a minute. Oh, okay. So I should go to the top? Is that what you're saying? Sorry about that. Please explain the difference between pages 1 and 2. Must both be filled out? Typically, how many releases of information might a child have? Is one release of information with multiple agencies or people sufficient if the parent is in agreement?
So the forms training explains the differences between the two pages in more depth, but it's important to review the information on the top of the form with the parent, understanding about implications of including multiple agencies on a single form. But if the parent wants, rather than is in agreement, it is the parent who really drives this process. If the parent wants to have one release of information with multiple persons included, that is most certainly okay. So you will have as many forms as needed to conduct the business you need to conduct and make sure the parent provides informed consent.
Okay, thank you. The box on the top right corner, the service coordinator use only box. When is this box completed and what is the purpose?
So there's more detail on that box in the forms training. The service coordinator records the date the form was received from another EI qualified personnel. So it will only be completed when applicable. Sometimes the service coordinator will have initiated this form and not someone else. The EI service coordinator case notes are supporting documentation about the origin of the form. For example, a polar provider or a primary service provider may have been the one sending this form, a copy of this form to the service coordinator.
Okay, thank you. On page 2, in the first box regarding consent for release and exchange of information, I think they want, please define case notes and assessments.
Oh, I think
You already answered that one, didn't you? Okay, how about this one? If we are only using one page, just wanting to send another provider an email update, but not the IFSP or any assessments, do we cross out the boxes on the first page or write NA?
So just complete just complete the sections that are applicable to what you need.
Okay. So I think we're in a situation due to time, Katrina, that we won't be able to keep sending in your questions via the chat or question box, but we're going to have to kind of move things along or we're going to run out of time. And we want to make sure that we answer all the questions that we received prior to the webinar.
Okay.
So we'll just keep moving, okay?
Okay. So EI-07, this is the consents for transition, and you'll notice there are two different consents embedded in this page. All the requirements for the use of this form can be found in paragraph L of the Eligibility and Services Rule 5123-10-02. The school district and ODE notification consent, and that's the top section of the form, must be completed at the IFSP meeting closest to, before, the child's second birthday, or whenever a child is determined eligible at or after 24 months of age. That second part is for kids that come into the system later. This form only covers consent for sharing PII with the LEA and ODE. Form EI-06 consent for release of record and exchange of information is still required to release child records and/or exchange information with the LEA. The bottom half of the form is specific to providing consent for a transition planning conference. Note that there are two possibilities included in the explanation: children potentially eligible for Part B preschool services, and child determined not to be potentially eligible for Part B preschool services. Per rule, the difference in the two is relevant to who is invited, the LEA for the first and other community providers for the second. Parents may choose not to give consent for the transition planning conference. Rule 2, paragraph J, still specifies the requirement for an IFSP meeting and the development of transition planning outcome or outcomes, regardless of whether a TPC is held. These activities must also be documented in case notes.
Katrina, we received one question regarding EIO 7. If a parent checks they do not give consent for a transition planning conference, then the child has no transition planning? Previously, all children were required to have a transition planning conference, whether the school district was invited or not.
So you will find that language in the rule, and it is correct that if a parent does not give consent, and that consent is required for under IDEA, if a parent does not give consent to hold a transition planning conference, there will be no transition planning conference. However, the IFSP transition outcome is still required. So there's a distinction. You still will have an IFSP meeting, you will still do transition planning, but you're not having the planning conference, which requires by law certain people be invited.
Okay. EIO 8.
So in EIO 8, this is the consent to refer child to the LEA. This form is very specific and we suspect it will have very limited use for obtaining consent. It is only for obtaining parent consent to share child and parent information with the LEA and ODE when the referral comes to the EI system 45 or fewer days before the child's third birthday, and the parent wants the EI system to make the referral to the LEA and ODE. So it will be rare that an EI service coordinator will need to use this form because most of the time the situation will be handled at central intake. However, on the chance that the EI service coordinator or EI service coordination agency receives that referral, this form is available for use. I don't believe we received any questions for EI 08. So professional referral follow-up. Parent consent is required for the EI Service Coordination Agency to provide information about the child's status in the EI system to the referral source. Typically, the service coordinator will take this form to a meeting with the parent and explain who made the referral and what information would be shared with the referral source if the parent consents, and what will be shared if the parent does not consent. The service coordinator makes sure the parent understands to what he or she is giving consent and the dispute resolution options before obtaining consent. If the parent does not want to give consent, the parent does not sign and date this form. If the parent does not provide consent, the service coordinator may return the form to the referral source with the top section. You'll note that that's the date, child, date of birth, referral source, and one of the two boxes marked indicating parent did not give consent to share information or the parent could not be contacted. Those are the only that's the only information that may be provided without parent consent. EI service coordinator will need strong case notes to document conversations with or attempts to contact the parent. I believe we received one question.
Yes, we did. If the professional referring the child to early intervention is within the early intervention system, do we still need specific consent to send the referral follow-up form?
So remember, we talked about those definitions of provider and participating agency. As long as the referring entity meets the definition of participating agency, no consent for follow-up is needed.
Okay, thank you. 15.
The next two forms are used to determine the parent's ability to pay and to obtain consent for use of insurance to pay for EI. These two forms must be completed for families of all eligible children. Other SOP forms will be covered in later webinars on the SOP. That's June 11th and June 13th. So for this one, EI 15, determination of parent ability to pay for EI services. We split out one of the current forms we use. Determination of a parent ability to pay had the consent to access insurance on it, so we just have two new forms, but the form should be largely familiar. This form is completed with the parents of all eligible children. It's used to determine whether the parent has the ability to pay for EI services. The parent ability to pay is relevant only after 55 units of EI have been used via the IFSP in an IFSP year. The form is valid for 1 year and must be completed again before the annual IFSP and when the parent informs the service coordinator of an income change with the family. Remember, case notes, documentation is also required, and I don't believe we received any questions on that form. No, we did not. EI 05, consent to use insurance for EI services. The requirements for use of this form are addressed in multiple rules, and you'll see those on the slide. Note that the service coordinator must have explained the system of payments rules to the parent. Information is included in the SOP parent brochure prior to obtaining consent using this form. This form must be completed in the first 45 days prior to the initial IFSP or during the IFSP meeting, and within 45 days of the annual IFSP. It also needs to be reviewed with any changes in the IFSP or when the child-parent insurance enrollment changes. The service coordinator completes this form with the parent of every eligible child in EI. It provides the necessary consents for use of private, that's at the top section of the form, or public insurance, that's the bottom section. Parents may consent to one or both or neither, depending on the type of insurance the parent or child have and the parent preference.
We have a couple questions. There are two sections. It's assumed a yes, no, or child does not have insurance would be checked for both sections. Is it necessary for the parent to sign on both sections, or can the parent not sign on the section if the box, my child does not have public or private insurance, is checked?
So we don't really have a box anymore that just generally my child doesn't have these insurance. So the form has two sections, one for private insurance at the top, one for public insurance at the bottom, and both sections need to be reviewed and completed with the parent.
Second question. We will always have questions about our church fund families. Do we just mark we do not have private insurance and we do not have Medicaid And have families sign both places?
Yes, the parents would still need to complete both sections of the form.
Will there always be two parent signatures on this form? One on each half of the page?
Yes, as we've discussed, there are two different purposes.
And then this is more of a comment. We would like directions.
So we will provide directions in the form of guidance document in August, and that will be located on the website under the System of Payment tab. So it explains every part of the current 1701, pages 1 and 2. And we will make those changes updated to reflect this form. So there's currently guidance, and we're updating that guidance, and it will be available as Diane pointed out earlier.
Okay, EI 12.
So the last two forms we'll discuss today are EI 12, which is this one, and EI 13 for the IFSP meeting notice. So EI 12 is documentation of diagnosed condition, and this form is used by the medical professional to document diagnosed conditions not on the automatic eligibility list that the medical professional believes for a particular child is likely to result in a developmental delay. We must obtain consent on EI 06 to release information to the medical professional before the service coordinator may send this form. It is the responsibility of the medical professional to complete the rest of the form entirely.
And I don't think we have any questions for EI 12.
So for EI 13, which is the IFSP meeting notice, it is not a prior written notice form. It is the meeting notice. It's completed by the EI service coordinator and provided to the parent and others, and documents the type of planned IFSP meeting and the finalized date and time of the meeting. Generally, only one box for the type of meeting will be checked, except when the IFSP meeting will include the transition planning conference.
Okay. We only received one question, Katrina, on this one. Can you clarify how this works with transition?
So this form would be used to, it would be given to the parent and other participants, inviting them to the transition planning conference, and that would be the last box. And then in this instance, at least one other box would also be checked, indicating whether the IFSP meeting is the initial, annual, or periodic review.
And we have one clarifying question. What is the timeline for this form?
So that requirement is in Eligibility and Services Rule 02. Content notice. I believe it's with enough.
For the initial and annual? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's language in meeting arrangements shall be provided to the parent and other participants early enough to ensure they will be able to attend. So that's the requirement in rule.
And we'll make sure we address this in the FAQs too. All right. We kind of have one additional question, kind of a general question. It's like, can the forms be made into Word documents? If not, can all forms be combined into one large PDF so all forms can be saved at one time rather than needing to download and save each form separately?
So yeah, yes and no. We we cannot provide them as Word documents because we are not able to secure forms that are Word documents, but we will be providing PDF documents in a single PDF. It's called a binder, binder. That's in process, is nearly complete, and that will have all the forms in it so the service coordinator can type in the child's name and EIDS, and that information will auto populate across forms for that child. So all the forms will be there. Obviously, certain forms like the screening and the referral to the LEA and ODE within 45 days of the child's birthday, those will not apply to a lot of children, but all the forms will be available in that binder. And that's part of going back to what Diane was saying about having information in the newsletter and other communications with the field about having the most up-to-date Adobe. So we are in the process. Thank you for that question.
And coming out this week's biweekly will be a reminder to update your Adobe to the most recent version, and then a link on how to do that with the instructions. So the document, and so by using this Adobe binder, you should be able to save them. And also if you need additional like outcome pages and that kind of thing, you'll be able to do that also. I want to share this resource that we developed for you, the prior written notice and consent crosswalk. I think this might answer a lot of the questions that we have left. So it's fairly easy to follow. So kind of before you do this, you just go and let's say before you do an evaluation, if needed, make sure to complete prior written notice and consent for developmental evaluation and assessment EIO2. And you can, this is part of your handouts, so feel free to use it. And we will also post it on our website. Can move forward. See the 45 days, system of payment. Can move forward. And then transition and exiting a child. So we hope that you find this very helpful and answer your question as far as if I'm doing this type of activity, this is what I need to do related to prior written notice and consent. Okay, move forward. Would like to thank Katrina for taking her time and joining us today and going through the questions and answering the questions, even on the spot. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our 400 friends or so who have participated today. We really appreciate it. And we're already getting some lovely comments about the crosswalk, so thank you. So I hope you find it very useful. So Lori, finish it off for us. Oh, Lori, we had a lot of questions around where the forms training, the My Learning training is. So if we could go over that one more time, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, I was just going to do that. I saw a lot of questions about that and where to find the forms training. And this is the training that Katrina referenced a few times where she said more details and step-by-step instructions could be found. So that training is in My Learning, and you access that through the DODD portal. And then you'll go to, when you get to the home page of My Learning, there are numbers of different tiles that you can click on. So you just want to click on Early Intervention, and then you're looking for the title Early Intervention New Forms Overview. And that will have your forms training in it. And it will also have an IFSP form training, which I believe is not quite available yet, but should be available soon. So look for that in My Learning, and you'll be able to get additional training right there. I did see one question that someone was looking for the trainings and they didn't seem to be there on My Learning, so I'm going to check on that. I know they were there yesterday, but I'll check on it again and make sure, see if we can find out what's going on and update that if necessary. All right, so now I wanted to go over the certificate instructions and some reminders. So first of all, as I said, we'll be answering the new questions submitted today in an FAQ, and that will be on the EI Rules 2019 tile of the website. We'll also be posting the recording of this webinar along with the other rule recordings on that same tile, so EI Rules 2019. We do have several more rule webinars coming up to finish up the series, and the registration information is also in that EI Rules 2019 tile. The next ones are next week, and that will be on System of Payments, and those are July 11th and July 13th. So the part 1 on July 11th is going to cover requirements for all families of eligible children, and then part 2 will go over requirements for families when a System of Payments provider is involved. And then after that, the last one will be June 18th, and that is on the IFSP form. So be sure to register for those if you have not already.